Welcome to today's CUGC Connect. My name is Stephanie Boozer. I'm with CUGC HQ and happy to see you all here today with Goliath Technologies. I'm going to be talking about proactive monitoring and troubleshooting and resolving end user issues from pretty much anywhere you are. This presentation is for you, and we would encourage all of your questions. So any that you may have, we'd love to have you type them into the question panel over to the right in the GoToWebinar control panel. We will get to those as we can, most of them probably at the end of the presentation. So before we dive in, I want to introduce who's on the call with us today. Our moderator is DJ Eshelman. He is a Nashville CUGC local leader and a CTA. You can follow him on Twitter at the Zen Master and check out what he's up to at his website, ctxpro.com. DJ, you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone.
Thank you. He'll be keeping an eye on your questions. So like I said, type them in and he'll be keeping a close eye on those. And next, I want to introduce our presenter, Raja Jadeja. He is with Goliath. He is the VP of Product Management, and he's done many webinars with us at CUGC in the past, so we're happy to have him back with us today. And I will turn everything over to him now. So take it away, Raja.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I didn't have a picture as good as DJ, so I'm sorry for not showing my face there. But I have over the next couple minutes and the rest of this hour, we have a good agenda set up for you guys. We'll be taking you through the technology a little bit. Just a quick introduction to Goliath. I promise the marketing is at an absolute minimum because I don't want to speak about it as much as you probably don't want to hear about it. And we'll go right into what we mean by pretty much anywhere in terms of monitoring, troubleshooting, resolving issues. We'll talk a little bit about what that means and how that manifests from the context of troubleshooting specifically. And we've got a couple use cases with our customers out there. And there's actually a little special surprise at the end. We have a completely new UI coming out. I'm going to give you guys a sneak preview of what that's going to look at. And of course, we're going to have some Q&A. And I'm sure DJ is going to try and hammer me with a couple tough questions along the way. So let's get everything going. So first of all, just to kind of give you some perspective as far as how we approach the marketplace with our solutions here at Goliath Technologies, primarily what we're looking to achieve with the technologies is to give IT admins the ability to anticipate problems, troubleshoot issues, ultimately resolve them, whether that's through some automation capability I built into the technology or with the empirical evidence that you can derive from the troubleshooting stage that ultimately lets you prevent problems and get proactive. I've been an IT admin in the past as well, and so I know how difficult it is to be a hero, if you will, and be on top of everything and having the data necessary to achieve the four things that you see here. Now, when we talk about monitoring from everywhere, one of the things we've realized, we've spoken more and more with customers, there used to be the concept, are you hosting it remotely or is it on-prem? And the fact of the matter is just about every single customer we have, whether you're small or large, all of the Citrix infrastructure and the core architecture is generally in some kind of a data center remote from your actual users. Beyond that, we are also seeing a lot of customers that are moving to working with MSPs where they have hosted infrastructures, maybe by a hosting provider. And then they are also perhaps digging into and looking into moving part of that architecture into the cloud, perhaps either that they're managing themselves or achieving through a MSP, or even some customers where they have a hybrid approach where there's some on-prem or in their data center, I should say, and some in the cloud where they may be for bursting perspectives or maybe certain departments. Now, when you have those types of architectures, troubleshooting and monitoring becomes more challenging. And our solution is designed to help you achieve and get across some of those boundaries and still maintain visibility to the entire IT infrastructure that you see at the bottom there. So you're any hypervisors that are on-prem, the machines that are hosted in the infrastructure, any physical servers that might be hanging around still, applications and databases that might be in the hosted environment, might be on-prem, might be in the cloud, the VDI, of course, and the published apps, published desktops you might have out there, network monitoring, NetScalers, and other ancillary components that all relate to and drive the visibility that you need. Now, when we approach some of those types of challenges and the data that we pull in with respect to them is really from the perspective of giving you the data you need from a troubleshooting perspective and monitoring perspective. And especially in the context of our dialogue today, the way that we kind of break down issues that users are running into and user experience problems is that for the most part, 95% of those issues really kind of break down into one of three categories you see at the bottom there. Logon initiation, making sure that they can actually get to Citrix, and that becomes more and more challenging, and there's a lot more finger pointing when you are remote hosted. Is it the hosting provider? Is it the network? Is it us? Is it them? The logon process is taking a really long time. And of course, at Ubiquitous, the concerns around what is the user's experience inside the session once it's fully launched, and the myriad of issues that can take place from that perspective. And we'll really kind of dig into that component of it. Now, in order to do that, and in order to gain visibility, we actually have some end-to-end visibility that we provide for you. So what that really means is if you look at the bottom there, kind of categorized into 5 different components that we can really pull. The big one is the end user experience, and it starts from being able to kind of correlate your users to the architecture that they're on, and then bring down information that with respect to it that's unique as well as meaningful and actionable to get to the root cause of problems that are taking place. We do have a logon simulation technology from an availability perspective and ensure the workflow and give you a better sense of uptime and availability. We're also pulling in the key ICX metrics and of course all the different channels. We've got some deep visibility into logon duration and also the session experience components of it. And then we're going to bring in some of those properties from Citrix that you see in the next tab on the application stack, the Windows stack we're going to see, and the underlying infrastructure in the 4th column there, whether you have NVIDIA, whether there's hypervisor information, as well as the storage on the back end network infrastructure too. Now, some of our customers, there's a, not entirely, I shouldn't say fully unique, but there's a unique vertical, the EMR EHR side of things, where they've got specific apps that are being delivered and often are remotely hosted and delivered into Citrix. We can also have some hooks into that component of it. For those of you that are out there in the healthcare side, there's some really cool modules that we have that will also bring in that layer specific and unique to those apps that can provide further visibility to understand better when someone says it's slow, where is it coming across these 5 different areas? So let's kind of pull this all together and talk about this in the context of a couple of use cases. So what does it mean to be able to kind of handle the different scenarios, whether it's remote hosting, the challenges thereof, and the visibility that you need? We'll talk through those different circumstances here and talk a little bit about how we achieve it and all those metrics and what that really means from a troubleshooting perspective. We have a couple use cases here from a couple customers of ours. One of them is MTM. MTM actually offers a hosted solution, a hosted DAS solution to customers. And so in order to actually ensure that they're delivering that in a meaningful way, they need to be able to have a way of actually, one, validating the uptime and availability. It's natural to have some servers down. In general, you design Citrix and implement it in a fashion to be resilient, meaning that if one component goes down, the entire world doesn't go down, the whole Citrix doesn't go down, it's still available. And obviously Citrix enables them to do so. So in that type of a context, how do you truly indicate uptime and availability? So we have a solution for that. And then once you get users into those sessions, and especially when you have multiple customers, how do you gain visibility of those sessions? So how do we pull all that data together? So we'll talk about that. And then from a customer perspective, we're going to talk about Catholic Health Initiatives and how they use our technology to understand problems that were affecting specific users, get ahead of users and be proactive. And then when users were having problems with their sessions, how are they able to dig down into the sessions themselves to get to the root cause of those problems? We have a couple of these scenarios. I'll also be talking above and beyond that where we had customers where they had technology, they had Citrix hosted by a third party, and how did they use our technology to get visibility into those hosted environments? I'll cover those along the way too. So in the course of this, we'll talk a little bit about those environments that are hosted, that might be in a cloud like we did with MTM, hybrid models as well. So we'll cover all of that in the different circumstances. Even if you are just you're an entity that has Citrix and you're hosting yourself in a data center, this will still be applicable to you. But we'll take a look at that a little bit more specifically as we get into the technology itself. So with that being the case, let me transition here into the technology. So bear with me for a few moments, and we're going to take a quick look at how do we gain visibility into what's going on inside your Citrix environment. Now, as I'm making this transition into here, and you'll see my screen here in just a moment, one of the key things to remember is that when we start looking at getting proactive and monitoring, it's some of that starts with actually just having the proper visibility to the environment itself and being able to see exactly what's going on. So the first thing I'm going to bring up here, you should be seeing in just a few moments. There's a couple key components that we use. So in all the circumstances that the use case I'm going to take you through, there's a couple specific areas that our customers generally start. And so before the calls start coming in and you're starting to troubleshoot specific scenarios, there's a couple screens that our customers have up and running all the time to ensure that their users are going to have a good experience and stay ahead of problems that might be taking place. One of those is our application availability monitor, and the other one is our topology view. And I'll talk a little bit briefly here up front about how that kind of fits into the scope of this before I dig further into those use cases. So starting with the application availability monitor, this is a unique technology that has the ability to be deployed to all the different locations where users are. So there's a couple cases where we had one customer that has their applications remotely hosted by their vendor. And so they often have problems where they get into finger pointing matches with that vendor saying, hey, this is down, it's not available. And they didn't have a good way prior to actually understand, are these issues on the hosted side, or is this an issue on the or is this a problem on their side of things? And there was a couple times where they actually had circumstances where users would call in and complain and say everything is down, and they would normally just call up the vendor and say, hey, it's your problem, and then it'd go through a whole process back and forth. And they go through a whole process back and forth of actually trying to understand where is that issue coming from? Is this an issue that's on their side, or is it on the remote hosted side of things? So the application availability monitor sits at all the different locations. This is actually a hospital. It sits at 33 different hospital locations, signing in over and over and over again to confirm availability of the environment itself from each one of those locations. And in one circumstance, they had a case where one of the hospitals, they had users calling into help desk saying no one can get in. Now, normally they just call up the actual vendor and again, just submit a ticket. But in this case, they saw the application availability monitor and this dashboard trending the overall availability of the apps themselves that are being delivered. This is also breaking down the logon time averages and the stage load averages too. And when they looked at this, they could see that everything was actually fully available. Now, in this case, we're seeing that the current availability is 33%, because to make it look good for you guys in our environment, we have to make it break sometimes. But this is giving us a sense of that overall availability, and we can even change that time frame. When they went into the analysis page, this allowed them to see a little bit better as far as the overall availability and when was it failing, if at all. What was interesting is when they hit the endpoints, they would see each one of those different locations, and it would tell them from any one of those sites and hospital locations, they can filter it down and see, okay, well, what's one of those locations actually seeing? And so they were able to pick that one location, hit the filter button, see that everything in their case was actually fully up and running. So before getting too far into the whole prospect from a troubleshooting perspective, and overall just getting an idea of what's up or not, this was huge for them because, one, if there was going to be a problem, they would have gotten notified by this technology first. There had also been some circumstances where they had like circuits got changed going into the NetScaler, the network team didn't talk to the host, the Citrix team, letting them know these changes taking place, everyone's offline. They got notified within about 30 seconds saying that all of a sudden none of the sites and locations were working. They got on top of it, got into the backup site, didn't even know that anything was down. In this circumstance, they saw that everything was up. And moreover, what's cool with this part of the technology, they can see each test that ran over the course of the day, and then they can actually drill down into it to see more about what was actually happening. So this gave them a quick snapshot to see the first stage of that process. They can see it bringing up the receiver page, passing through the credentials, validating as a result that they were able to get to storefront, telling them that the Active Directory authentication was working, storefront's responding, SDA communication is good because they're getting also their applications that are showing up on the back end, the SQL server's working because they was able to look up the user and see what rights that they had, and then finally launching the application itself to confirm that it came up. And in the same way, they're able to do these tests from a number of these other different locations and see each one of those timeframes and prove that, you know what, this was actually up the whole day and there were no problems whatsoever that were taking place. So they're able to keep on clicking into this and see, you know what, everything was fine. There's no issues here. And they had proof. They can go back to the local IT for those sites and say, hey, look, I can actually see in full screen that the application's launched and everything's working the way that it should be. What that meant is that instead of it's wasting another 2 hours going back to the actual hosting vendor, they're able to focus in on that one location. Turned out all those users were coming in over one access point, and that was the reason for the disconnects, the problems getting on, et cetera. So this was a big way to kind of stay on top of those problems, stay ahead of it, because if there truly was an issue, they would have gotten it from here, and they would have been able to turn back to the hosting vendor and see that something was actually broken. In fact, in one of these, and this is actually what MTM uses to confirm availability, because even if there's a storefront down or there's one of the other components, a delivery controller down, as long as that HA and that resiliency is in play and working, they're going to be able to get onto the environment. They're going to have users having no issues getting in, and they can confirm that in this way. Your normal ping tests and service checks aren't really meaningful in a Citrix environment because you could have things down for maintenance purposes, and it could be generating alerts, or even if you have it in maintenance mode. But more importantly, you could have situations where everything looks good from a ping and service perspective, but there's actually problems, licensing issues or something else, maybe you ran out of them. This is going to capture that because a lot of those error events, whether they're configuration related with your proxies or licensing ones, some of those error messages only show up on the endpoint, not in any log anyplace inside the infrastructure. So how are you going to know there's a workflow issue? This is the only way to do so, and this is what will actually do that and test that out for you. So in the scheme of things from a troubleshooting perspective, this is really the first step because this will really confirm and tell you at a high level, are there problems or not with even getting access to Citrix? And if there is, you can dig down into the different options here to see more about what was actually taking place. One of our use cases with CHI, they actually had a circumstance where they were seeing downtime following a patch management update. And so they had this running 24/7, every 5 to 10 minutes, launching sessions to make sure they're actually available. And so in this list, they could quickly see some are failing right away, other ones are failing with the application enumeration, and then they can click into this and again, see exactly what was happening. Again, each step of it shows up here. And then on the last page, they were able to see that the application that's supposed to be present wasn't actually there whatsoever. Now, that was important because when they went back to the application team, the first thing the app team said is, there's no problem. We did everything fine. There's no issue. She sent over the screenshot saying, well, look, it's still not there. And they went back and took a look at it. It looks like it turned out they'd applied a patch and made some changes. They had to republish the application. They wouldn't have known that otherwise until someone ran into the problem. It would have been 40,000 users in their case. I mean, they've got several hundred applications out there. They weren't testing each one with the exception of this technology. And until this caught it, they wouldn't have known that 40,000 users would have been offline. So before even getting to the point where you have to kind of troubleshoot and deal with remote hosted issues and these different infrastructures, whether it's internally, apps that you're delivering internally or through this type of some sort of a service, this is huge just to let you know if you're going to have a problem to begin with. Now, the other piece of our technology that we use in the case of troubleshooting and getting proactive is our Topology View. Now, what this Topology View is, and it's a little bit unique as compared to some of the other ones you might have seen, is that it will automatically and dynamically map out your environment, giving you the list of all your NetScalers, storefront, delivery controllers, your back-end components. It's going to have the health of the environment here on the right-hand side, telling you about any kind of issues that are trending, as whether there's components that are down, there's drive space issues. If you're having end user experience related faults instead of infrastructure ones like we're seeing, they would enumerate here, telling you number of concurrent users and sessions that are out there in the environment, as well as any kind of failures that are happening. And this will change contextually to whatever you select on the actual screen itself. So you go to the delivery controller and it's going to give you a quick view of the resource consumption, a quick check of all the different services that are out there, tell you how many machines, how many are actually unregistered. And so there's only 3 unregistered machines, 15% of it. So you know, if you start seeing like higher values there, that could be problematic, and that'll tell you what's going on. And then the next thing that we do is we're going to actually not just give you a physical mapping, but a logical mapping too. And so when you drill down, this will map out your delivery groups, your delivery groups, your machine catalogs, the images, And then when you go one step further, you're actually going to see it map out and tie in the back-end infrastructure as well. What's really cool with this type of a view is that we can see not just the actual delivery group information, but we're starting to pull in metrics from the actual rolled up at the delivery group and machine catalog level. So we have thresholds and alerts around all of these components, but sometimes when you're looking at Citrix related problems, especially from a getting proactive perspective, you want to see what's trending in the environment overall, right? You can troubleshoot, your help desk users are going to be troubleshooting individual user sessions, and we're going to show you some cool things we can do from that perspective. But this is really important because when you're trying to identify problems that are affecting, say, large numbers of users, you need to understand, especially if there's environment and resource issues and there's a downstream impact to numbers of users. This is how you're going to be able to see that, because we're going to take all those key metrics and present that to you. The overall CPU utilization of those VDI machines, the memory, the disk ops, the latency that's affecting them. And then we're going to break out each piece of ICA so you can see, are there network latency problems or ICA round trip time problems? Is that affecting logon duration and their connection speed as well? We had a case with one of our customers. They were going through a data center migration, and they had all the West Coast users connecting through the East Coast data center. Well, for the delivery group that those West Coast users were in, the East Coast users were in, it looked much like this. Everything was fairly normal, nothing very dramatic taking place. On the West Coast, they saw that logon duration times were not 30 seconds, but almost a minute and a half. Their network latency wasn't 60 milliseconds, 40 milliseconds, it was 150 to 180 milliseconds. And so all of these two prevailing characteristics had a downstream impact. Their latency times were higher, their round trip times were higher. And so they could see very quickly that same data center, same sets of machines and architecture underneath it, but on the actual delivery group side, because of the users coming from the West Coast, this latency was actually really driving a problem from an experience perspective. CPU memory was fine. We had other circumstances where users could see increasing resources and workloads. So they would see things on the hypervisor side of things here with your host, and seeing the CPU utilization going up and memory utilization going up and storage latency going up. And as this starts to climb, and they'd see these error events turn from green to orange and then red, suddenly they'd have the delivery group starting to jump up and showing issues that were taking place. So this is a quick way to see what's happening. Also giving a quick listing of the number of machines that are out there, sessions in use, how many apps are being connected to and are in use versus orphaned. So a quick way to get that macro view to understand the problems that are taking place affecting hundreds and thousands and multiple users, and what you might need to do that you can fix multiple of them, whether you need to do something on routing with networking, you need to get something resolved from a resource consumption perspective, and additional load on there, especially during snow days and things of that nature, and work from home times and holidays. You can see how that's all manifesting and rolling up. So this is a good way to get proactive, because you're going to see how things are starting to escalate and affect large numbers of users and not just single users too. So that being said, let's dive a little bit deeper into some of those specific use cases affecting when you are remote hosted and the problems that can actually take place. So with that in mind, I'm going to bring up I'm going to go over to the XenApps and Desktop session display and talk a little bit about user experience in the environment. So going over to View, we're going to go to XenApps and Desktop session display. And from this view, there's a couple screens I wanted to point out to you. If you look towards the top of the display, you'll see 3 different radio buttons there. These radio buttons are going to be your app servers, published apps and desktops, and your virtual desktops and VDI as well. Now, what's cool by breaking it down this way is that this is going to let you get not just real-time information, but historical data too. So in the circumstances where you're troubleshooting user connections and issues, there's a couple things that come to mind. Especially when you have remote hosted, you have cloud infrastructures, as well as maybe a service provider hosting for you. There's a couple circumstances that you're concerned with. One is, what's the density like in terms of users per host and machines, and how are they responding to resource consumption? And is there a downstream impact in terms of the user experience thereof? The other concern is with respect to the networking. Well, now you don't have it all in one single facility. You're now going to a data center. You're going to Amazon or the data center. You've got a a MSP that's hosting for you, well, what's the experience going to be like for the users coming in, and how do we know if there's a networking or routing issue taking place? Well, all of that data is going to be able to be derived from here. And generally, when you have help desk starting with troubleshooting these circumstances, they've got a user calling in saying they have a problem. And so from that perspective, let's drill down to see a little bit how we kind of approach those situations and circumstances. So whether if you have published apps and desktops, you'd see that information right here. A couple quick data points. This first view is great because it's going to tell you not just the server that they're on, but the user machine, their address that they're coming in from, the logon duration, how long it took them to get into it, and also Citrix receiver version. One of the challenges when you're rolling out clients to the environment is that you might have pockets of users that have older versions, and you might be making changes on the infrastructure side that are going to have a downstream impact to user experience if they're not on the right version of the client itself. You can target that right away, and before you get too far ahead, you can start addressing those problems. We also have ICA latency metrics here so you can understand that prevailing condition. Are they having latency issues on those connections themselves before you even drill down? The same type of data we have on the virtual desktop side of things too. Now what's cool with this is that it's not just a real-time information, but historical too, because more often than not when users call in, one of two things happen. It's either they're experiencing it while they're in this session right now, or it was a session that happened going on for a month is that the simple fact that you need context. Is this a long-running issue that might be affecting other people? Is a long-running issue that's been happening for that long, or they just feel like it's been that way? Name, change the type.
Hey, Raja, I think we're experiencing some audio issues on your end. If there's something you can adjust there for us.
And bear with me for just a quick moment here.
Okay. And while he's doing that, just there's a little icon there you can use for just to raise your hand. I'll just show of hands who out there is seeing this kind of thing resonate with them, where they really need to have that real-time ability to see whether or not users can actually connect or not. Got a few hands going up there. Looks like that's good to see. All right.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to make sure this stays relevant. And the next couple of things we're going to dig into deeper, DJ, is a little bit more about the user experience, how that kind of resonates back through, and how they can kind of take action against it. So we kind of like set up the table, so to speak, and now let's dig into some of those really actionable metrics and find out, what's going on in user sessions and how to get through that. So
awesome.
With that being the case, I'm going to keep on going ahead now. So I had a user call in. I search for that user using the search function at the bottom. I can bring back not just the user's current session, but all their previous sessions. Oftentimes when someone says it's been slow over a period of time, maybe they mean all the times they're working from home. Well, we can see the client's address. So were they on the office network? Were they on a different subnet altogether, the receiver version at each one of those locations? Maybe they're going between a Mac and a PC, and the Mac was at home and is running a really older version of the client, maybe 10 dot something. Well, we can see all of that from here, and then we can dig down into any one of those, either the current session or a previous session as well. So this will allow us to see some of that information just by clicking on it real quickly. And so with that in mind, let's actually dig down into one of these sessions to find out what was actually happening in the course of their session and with that user's experience. Okay. So when I click down on this session, there's a lot of additional data that's actually coming back. If you notice the tabs across the top, it's breaking down different characteristics around this user's session. Now, first of all, if you look at the bottom here in this timeline, this was actually a session that took place yesterday. So I have all of this information and very granular, even though this was something that took place yesterday. Now, if you look at the top there, there's connection performance information, logon duration, we'll get back to it. Some other performance characteristics from the user's channels and how the ICA was being used, server-side application. We'll dig into that in a moment. But the first question in these circumstances, when it's remote hosted, cloud hosted, even on-prem, the same issues kind of are prevalent. But when the first thing that we need to figure out is, are they having a problem with their connection, or is it resources to support their session? And this screen gives us that first answer at the very high level. Now, what's interesting here is at the top level, we're actually breaking down the three different characteristics of what's actually happening in terms of ICA behavior. And so from an ICA perspective, we can see very quickly, is it ICA latency, is it the round trip time, or network latency? Now, that network latency metric is pretty unique, and the reason it's unique is the fact that it can allow us to see and understand if it's something that's going through the network, we're actually measuring that through the ICA connection itself. And from the ICA connection, I can understand very quickly if they're taking into consideration QoS, if you're using Riverbed, WAN optimization to make sure that ICA packets are very low latency connections, we can see that very quickly from the network latency side of things. And what's also interesting is, as a side note here, we can see how ICA is handling these spikes too. So you'll notice these spikes with network latency getting up to like 2,500 milliseconds, 5,000 milliseconds. Well, what we can see here is that when these spikes take place, when it hits the actual session host itself, the Citrix side of things is actually bottoming those out and handling it using their caching mechanisms, the intelligence in the protocol to minimize network latency. So we're actually measuring that metric from the actual user's endpoint through the actual connection itself to the session host in real time, and this is the only technology that can do that and read that data back to you and show it to you. So that's pretty cool, as you can see the true network latency affecting those users. Moreover, we can also see how it's flattening out the round trip time that the user experiences. Even though it got to 5,000 milliseconds here and it hit that at the session host too, you can see that the user only experienced about a second's worth of latency, again, using all those different mechanisms to really kind of bottom that out and make it a lot more manageable. And so this makes it a lot easier. You can see how much work Citrix is actually doing for you. But by looking at this, we can quickly see, is there a connection-related problem with network latency? We're also measuring the connection speed. So that user might have an endpoint that maybe they're working at home and they have all the other downloads taking place. Maybe they're an executive walking through the office and he wanted to use Citrix on his iPad and he's on Wi-Fi, or he's on a hotspot and traveling and you have a user in a hotel. Well, that connection speed is going to vary dramatically, and the amount of bandwidth available to that endpoint is going to be showing up here. So if it is that executive on their endpoint, on their iPad, and they're running with the iOS updates or app updates at the same time and it's fighting for bandwidth, this will represent it. If it's that user that's working from a hotel and they've got really bad connection speed because it's on a shared network and they've got a lot of other business users, this will manifest there. Or in these cloud-hosted environments, you'll see if you're getting enough bandwidth availability. We've had cases with customers where they've got poor routing between locations and that network latency will show up. So at the outset, we've had a case with some of our customers with MTM, actually, some of their users where we're coming in and having some poor problems. This would identify those circumstances very quickly. One of our other customers was having an issue with users that were coming in from India. Now, we expect network latency to be around 150 to 250 milliseconds, and that's really what we saw here, and we saw that ICA was matching to that. Not much you can do about that in India, but what we could do something about and what we saw is that connection speed was around 100 to 200K per second per user. Well, we can also reflect that we're on the bandwidth requirement for those users, and so we saw those really just hitting a peak over and over and over again. And more importantly, as connection speed changed for those users in India, and that as there's congestion on those lines and connection speed dropped and bottomed out like we see here, down to like 30K per second, we saw how that caused an increase in ICA round trip times and network latency, and ICA latency as well. So this showed them very quickly how the network side of things was manifesting and contributing to problems. You can just print this out as a report to have your evidence, gives you the user, where they were in the environment, the performance characteristics around it. So this is huge to giving you right away that answer as far as where the problems are coming from if it is network oriented. Now, at the same time, let's say it's not a network oriented issue. and you need to find out more about, well, how is it, what's going on inside of those sessions that might be causing those problems in that environment? Do you have too much density on your VMs? Did you spec out those VMs the right way? You know, the finance guys are telling you in a cloud-hosted environment that we can only pay for X type of resources, or the hosted infrastructure is giving you like a template standard type of sizing, but not taking consideration maybe some of the behavior of your users and the applications they use. Well, the first step to get a context of what the user is doing is to go to the ICX channel. And from here, we're going to see, with respect to the connection speed and latency, what was going on inside of that session. This is going to break down each channel that's being used, and this is important just to give you context as you take the next step from here. Is there a lot of thin wire bandwidth utilization? Thin wire is a display adapter for Citrix. So if there's a lot of bandwidth usage, they're doing something that's changing a lot of pixels on the screen, a lot of screen refreshes. Just to give you an idea, if they have Microsoft Word open, they're probably going to use, and even if they're like typing super fast and moving a lot of images around in there, no more than 300 to 400K per second, and generally much less than that, because what Citrix will do is it will cache the most of the text on the page and only change and pass through the pixels needed to change around the cursor. There's a lot of cool things that Citrix does, even on your worksheets. If they are on a web page and doing research and even doing email, they might be getting up to like a megabyte, 1.2 megs per second. To get up to this level of utilization, full screens pixels must be changing out, whether it's video, a lot of graphics. If it's something with respect to, they're on ESPN Fantasy Football, and I've seen that before, where it starts, all those ads start running through, and I'll show you kind of like how we can see some of those characteristics, because the next thing that we do is we go to the application performance. Now, when we go to application performance, it's going to pull a list of all the different processes that are running. Now, a couple things stand out right away. Citrix Graphics using almost a full core of CPU utilization. A quick sidebar, how can you have more than 100% of CPU? Well, if you have multiple cores applied to the different VMs, we read it the same way that Windows does, allocating and considering each process or each core is 100% pool of CPU resources. So I can see, for instance, that I have 1.2 cores available in terms of available headroom. But Citrix Graphics is doing a lot of work. Google Chrome is using almost a full core. We have another instance using half a core. So this is actually pretty bad. And so when you go to the application tab, we can find out what's using it. Well, here we can see that they have Chrome open with the Norse attack map. Just like that is pulling over the name of the actual page itself, we've seen circumstances where users have, for instance, ESPN Fantasy Football open. We've also seen cases where they have the type of utilization we saw, and they're doing actual work. Doctors that are doing research on YouTube and looking at procedures and things of that nature. Or we've had cases with radiologists that are going in, or people on the executive team, the secretaries that are going through presentations and clicking through all those different images, and it has animations on there. So you have to, the balance then to understand, is this an aberration in terms of behavior and what they shouldn't be doing, or is this actually something they should be able to do? And we need to understand that they're going to have a lot of processes running, and it's going to use a lot of resources. What also helps, where this also helps from a troubleshooting perspective, when you have those users calling in and saying, hey, it's slow, and then you find out that they had like 10 instances of the inbox open or of the same Excel spreadsheet, this will list and iterate that and show you that information so you can quickly identify it. Now, we've had some cases with customers where they had recently switched to a hosted platform, and what would happen is, and this was actually the case with CHI, where they had these new sets of users that were coming in, and they were having problems, but only on Fridays between 10 and 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, they couldn't quite figure out why that was possibly the case. They gave more resources to the Citrix environment. They checked the networking, and they couldn't figure out what it was. Stepping through these screens and seeing, for instance, and validating, okay, the user, their connection and bandwidth utilization is all nominal. There's nothing wrong here. They have plenty of bandwidth. ICX Channel, nothing crazy like this going on. In fact, they're using less than 150K per second, so there's not a lot of activity. Application performance, not chewing up a lot of resources, so nothing with their behavior, nothing to do with the apps that they're running that are leaking resources. And then server performance. From here, we can dig down into the actual host and the VM that they're on to see what's actually going on from a resource perspective. What's cool about this is it's going to allow us to see not just the actual CPU memory utilization coming from, in this case, the hypervisor. We're tying in all the data from the hypervisor too, right? So we have the ICA side of things, including the channel usage, the Windows level in terms of application performance, and now looking at the VM, whether it's a VDI and it's a single user on there, or it's multiple users, we'll see the CPU memory utilization from the hypervisor, some Windows layer activity as well. And so we can see things, for instance, these spikes in CPU utilization. If you're doing cache on RAM, are you suddenly paging a lot of data because they're filling up the RAM cache? Or in the case of this customer, getting into the disk performance side of things, where we could see that disk latency was starting to get, in their case, 6,000 milliseconds, 8,000 milliseconds. I mean, can you imagine what those users are probably encountering from a user experience perspective with 8,000 milliseconds of storage latency? Well, it turned out that those users, they were able to, one, print this off so you can show that, no, it really is getting to 4,000, 6,000, 8,000 milliseconds of latency between 10 to 1 o'clock. Well, they can not just have that information, but they were able to turn that back to the storage team. Turns out that they had snapshot-based backups running at that specific point in time, changed the schedule on it, problems went away. But this gives you that visibility. It gives you the ability to kind of step through all those different layers of it to say, okay, it's not their connection. It's not something unique with their behavior. It's not something at the application level in terms of leaking resources, or even at the host level, or in terms of how that's being allocated. It has everything to do in this case with storage itself. So this was very important to see exactly broadly what was the experience like and what was going on for those users. Now, one of the other circumstances that was taking place with some of our customers was long logons. Now, logons can be challenging because there's a lot of components that drive it. And when you're onboarding new customers and trying to shift platforms, perhaps going to, say, Citrix Cloud plus Amazon, going from your on-prem to, say, a hosted provider, or even on-prem, you're upgrading to the newest versions, there's changes that you're going to do at the same time. You're not carrying over exactly the same thing. And so whenever that change happens, you need to be able to dig into those details to find out why all of a sudden is it going well or poorly for them in terms of a logon perspective. Because let's be honest, when you start bringing people onto a new platform, if it takes forever for them to get in, getting them to adopt that and not go back and say, I don't know, I don't care what you just did, give me back what I had before it worked, and that's what I want to do. Stepping in the way of progress, if you will. And so the data that we have here is really important for that, because much like you get with Director, you're going to see the top level data points in terms of how that's kind of rolling up. And this is something that our customers will use in conjunction with that. So this kind of lets you kind of marry that up to say, okay, the same data, that's good. Let's look a little bit deeper. So you don't have to keep going back and forth. You can see the following stages below that. When we look at the client and server validation stages, this is going to allow us to see very quickly what's going on those endpoints to launch those Citrix sessions and what's going on the infrastructure side as far as brokering and establishing it. We've seen cases where these client and server validation times can get much, much higher. And so looking in the middle here, we're actually breaking out the brokering portions of it. Now, some of you guys might remember EdgeSite. It has some of this great data that we're showing up here. Well, we've kind of brought that forward in supporting on 7.x as well, where you can see things, for instance, how long was it taking for authentication to take place back to AD? What was the delay in terms of getting the session host prepared and ready to accept the inbound connection? One of the cool things that happens with 7.x is it starts bringing up any logon scripts and profile load functions and starting that during the brokering process, while at the same time on the endpoint is starting to launch those sessions. We can see how long that's actually taking. And then in the Citrix receiver side of things, on the endpoint itself, we can see, was there any kind of problem with the ICX file download? Was there any kind of delay with name resolution that's taking place? And also, how long did it take for Citrix receiver to launch? If you have prompts along the way that users have to engage, you might be looking at a protracted logon duration because they didn't really engage the screen itself. They stepped away to get coffee. They came back 2 minutes later, and that's why it took a long time. Well, those are going to show up here in these bottom portions, so you can see that there's a delay taking place, and that's the stage it happened at, and you can ask those questions. The cool thing is, by seeing this broken out in this fashion, you can very quickly isolate infrastructure problems, receiver endpoint issues, session host sides of things too. A lot of our customers have questions with respect to desktop load. Well, we're going to break that out a little bit further. We're going to start measuring that time earlier so we can see exactly where that's happening. And then at the bottom here, we can understand if the desktop load is something that you need to be worried about as well, the interactive desktop as you might see it inside of Director. So when the user starts signing in, we're going to pull over the name of the domain controllers that are being actually used. We'll see the actual policy objects that are getting copied over, the group policies, how long that took. Each execution that took place as far as folder redirection, drive mappings, printer mappings, et cetera, are all going to break down at the bottom. And more importantly, in this type of a case, we can see how much that desktop load correlates to when the user didn't see sessions starting to appear. And so we know that the user started the whole process at 10, 11, and 33 seconds. Well, we know that looking at 10, 12, and 1 second, they started to see sessions showing up on the screen itself. So roughly about 28 seconds later, they were able to start getting to the point where they should have been able to see the desktop and interact with it. So 21 seconds of this was actually just waiting for that desktop load function of it. Just by explanation, that desktop load is actually in the system tray. For instance, you start seeing your processes or your different apps starting to load out, background jobs that are running behind the scenes that are still taking place when you kind of boot up your laptop or desktop, and you can start working with it, but there's still stuff going on behind the scenes. That's that desktop load phase. And this way you can look at this and see very quickly, users got in at this stage. Now with one of our customers, what had happened, this is actually just a quick screenshot of it. We were able to see that their logons are looking at something like 349 seconds. And just to kind of show it up and bring it up on the screen itself. You could actually see how the actual logon times were really, really high. See the profile load time that was actually consuming that time frame, and then further the actual registry extensions that were actually causing that to happen, some further logon scripts that were executing too. So they had the exact answers to what was happening. We've similarly seen cases where copying information from the domain controller because maybe they went to the wrong one started taking a long time. We had a case with customers where they moved to a hosted platform, and they started to see like it was taking 2.5 minutes for logons to take place. Found out, again, domain controller, authentication coming back to the data center, back up to the session, the hosted environment was causing delays in that round trip. They moved the domain controller into the hosted environment, and those times went away. So this was huge in terms of reducing those issues and resolving those types of conditions. And all of this data is relevant not just in the context of a on-prem environment, but also an environment where you're actually doing stuff remote as well. So this is really kind of important for all those different circumstances. Just a couple things as well, just to point out, there's some leading indicators to these performance issues as you start shifting to these types of architectures. And one of those is like some of the details that we saw with respect to connection performance that are leading indicators, proactive indicators to problems, application performance issues. And so how do you get notified about those in advance, perhaps, and not just waiting for users to call in to dig through these screens? Well, we have a dashboard that kind of presents that information up, if you will, where you can see all the different conditions that are taking place. And these events that are transpiring in the environment, you can see some of those details and those alerts showing up in this type of a view, but what's driving it is a set of rules and conditions and alerts that are taking place behind the scenes. So from here, you can see all those different types of events that are happening. Active Directory logon replication issues, applications crashing and hanging. We have some rules built in, for instance, with AWS, your core infrastructure, group policy problems, printing and profile issues. So we built in all the different events and conditions that normally take place that we either drive through alerts or actually through reporting. So like applications crashing and hanging, for instance, we generally put out a report for that because that can be a problem frequently. But what's also interesting from this is that some of these circumstances, you can actually automate some handling around. So a lot of the times in these environments, you have drive space that's kind of limited. Well, we're not only going to look for drive space availability, but we can look for the condition where the drive space starts running out and execute a script to go and say, clear out the temp folders and some of the other directories and things of that nature so that they can stay refreshed and clear as the drive space gets slow. We can also do things, for instance, looking for the print services, where in the condition of a print service going down, we can certainly restart it. But then oftentimes when that happens, it's not enough. We can identify the circumstance where it failed to restart and then also automatically identify that condition and then remediate using a script. Kill the process, clear the print queue, start it back up again. So anything that you can run with PowerShell and such, you can actually apply in here to execute automatically in the basis of those thresholds. And those thresholds can include things, for instance, like those indicators to performance problems in these hosted environments or remote hosted environments too, such as end user experience types of conditions too. So looking at that from a performance perspective, we can trigger off on things like ICA latency, round trip times, network latency too. And we can put durations around it because you might not really care about ICA latency because those spikes will usually get handled. You want to know if it's been happening for a period of time. So we can set thresholds around all those key characteristics. So you get notified about that. So with that in mind, I'm going to go back to the presentation here for a moment and just show you some of the new things that we have coming up as far as the technology was concerned.
While you're doing that, you mind if we have a few quick questions here? I just want to highlight a few.
I'm sorry, DJ. I missed that as did you ask
Not
me
a
a question
problem.
there?
Yeah, just a few questions to highlight.
Sure.
First, I thought was pretty interesting is a question about the discovery, how that works, if it's just an automatic process to go out and discover services. If you could talk just a minute about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the cool thing with the topology is that it'll automatically map this out for you. The way that it does that is you point us to your delivery controller, and then from the delivery controller, we can actually determine things like your PVS. We can determine the virtual environment behind it, your licensing server, AD, and then start mapping and building this type of an environment out, as well as the delivery infrastructure too. So it automatically does it, assimilates all the inventory. So this type of a mapping fully shows up in that type of a context. So you'll get that just by giving us a delivery controller, one of them even, and we'll find the other ones for you. Your storefront and NetScalers, you do have to define those because they're kind of isolated from the delivery controller, but everything else is automatically built for you.
Awesome. And then along the line of that question, as far as just kind of talking about the dashboard in general and how that can be used to determine problem areas like SQL, SMB shares, and things like that, to maybe dive more into detail on that as well.
Sure. So there's a couple things that we can do around those types of conditions. I'll show you real quickly from here. And so, for instance, we can do things like set up alerting around those types of components of it. For instance, if there's problems with SQL, we can do ODBC connections and SQL connections and make sure they're up and responding. We'll pick up information from the delivery controller side if it stops connecting to the SQL server in the back end. We have rules that are built in that we can manipulate. We have some that are built in out of the box, and other ones like for SMB shares that we can build specific to some of those for your profile servers to make sure they're up, they're running, if they're hitting on kind of performance thresholds as well. And DJ, I'm just going to go to a set of slides real quickly, and then we'll go back to Q&A just to kind of tie that up, and we'll go through all of those. This will be real quick, but this is some of the cool new stuff that we have that I'll share with you guys. So let me just skip ahead here. All right, so real quickly here, I'm just going to go through a couple of these and we'll get back to your questions. I know there's a bunch out there. This is a new display that we're doing. You saw what it looked like before. We're completely revamping it. So on this session display, you're going to have a real-time view. It's going to trend out your user sessions in terms of the key metrics that are available there. We're adding in on-demand actions too, where you can actually click a user, disconnect them, log them off, perform other actions with respect to that. And what's really interesting is because we have a lot of data that you saw over the last couple minutes, but when you actually dig down into these sessions, the first thing you're going to get is a summary screen. The big question is when you go in, I don't want to go through all the different tabs to figure out what to actually figure out and what I have to monitor. We're going to tell you what that is. So we'll give you some context, tell you the endpoint, the NetScaler they went through, the delivery controller, AD, the session host, the high-level logon stages, so if you need to worry about that or not, and then those key performance metrics from the end-user experience, the VM they're on, the host behind it, with flags indicating that there's alerts and faults that are taking place along the way. We're also going to be context in terms of the channel utilization. Is this something that you need to be worried about because you're using a lot of bandwidth, and which one of those channels is it that's using it, as well as the apps that are running out there too. And then when you step through, like that logon duration, that chart's a little bit hard to see the way it is now. we built in some automation around it to build an automatic waterfall. So real time and historically, you'll see all the information in terms of what the user experience is actually like. And so this will quickly give you some visibility as far as what's going on. You can expand them out, you can see the durations, and like with the desktop load, you can quickly surmise what's actually causing that performance. With the ICA metrics, we're bringing them back now to one screen instead of those two different tabs, so you can very quickly see all the data in one spot at the same time, really quick and fast. We're bringing in also your, not just the server perspective, but we're also going to show the alerts that are taking place there in the top right, how long it's been up, how those events kind of break down, as well as your host. So from one view, you can see the users, their end user experience, the server they're on, the host that they're sitting on as well, and how that's performing. Is there CPU ready conditions and storage latency problems that are affecting the VM, as well as the other VMs that are down there that are running on that host that might also be impacting it. You can have a couple VMs that are chewing up tons of CPU, impacting your user and the server that you're digging down into, and you can identify the root cause of it very quickly then. And then we're also bringing in from those application performance tabs, we're going to be trending out the CPU memory utilization, that same view. Again, each one of these tabs have remediation actions at the top. And this one, for instance, you can cap the CPU memory utilization instead of just killing it, which you can do as well. You can do other actions that you can script. So anything that you can script, you'll be able to have access to from this remediation tab and action tab. So you can very quickly clear cache, gather additional metrics, any number of other things too along the way. And then what's really interesting, I know this is a little bit nuanced data, but we're going to have your alerts and your event logs pulled together into a single view. So you can get alerts that whether it's end user experience, performance, or faults, and then the event logs for this user session, so you can see what might have been driving it and following it as well. So you can get down to root cause and the full impact along the way. All right, DJ, I just want to share some of that with you because I think that kind of ties together the whole workflow we went through, a little bit easier process now with the new views.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're about to the end of today's session, but I think we can take a few minutes and just highlight a few other questions if you don't mind.
Sure, absolutely.
One that I thought was really interesting and just maybe to talk a little bit more about as far as looking at the availability analysis view and having the screenshots there of each phase of the login and things like that. I thought that was a really cool feature. The question came up is that run on dedicated VMs? And I think I want to expand that question actually to, is it possible to use that at other locations as well? So you just have a test, either VM or a test machine that's set up to do automated tests and report that back.
Yeah, so I mean, we have customers deploying that technology. You can have it on dedicated VMs, like in the case of it is on the hosted side of things. In the case you're deploying out to your user sites, you can have a notebook, a laptop, a desktop, something sitting in a closet someplace, and that can execute the actions themselves. A couple things to note there, because it's going to build a real Citrix session, it needs to be something that users aren't engaging at that same time. And you probably don't want it to be one of your user accounts that you use as well, because it's going to pull those sessions over, just a real user, which is what you want, right? It's going to go through that whole process the entire time, executing everything automatically, grabbing those screenshots and what's exactly happening.
Okay, awesome. And then one other question that I thought was good was regarding what hypervisors are supported currently and anything coming down the road.
Yep, absolutely. So we do support the major ones. So most of our customers are on VMware, Zen Server, some Hyper-V as well. So we do support all three of those. So yeah, I mean, if there is some other platform that customers have, they can certainly reach out to us and we can talk to them about that. But we support all of those with that same type of visibility.
Awesome. Awesome. And then I think that's probably all the time we have for today. Unless there's any other closing thoughts you have, and then we'll just do a few housekeeping items.
No, that was it. I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of share the technology with you guys, and I'll be able to show you some of the new stuff we have coming out too. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to us either through CUGC, our contact information through our website, and we're more than happy to help and answer anything that we didn't cover.
Absolutely. And do remember, folks, that Stephanie put a link out into the chat window with a survey for today. And your answers are anonymous, of course, but it helps us gather feedback to make these webinars as good as possible to focus in on you, the Citrix user, because that's what we're all about here. You can follow us on Twitter at myCUGC, and we'll be letting everybody know about the winners for today in a little while. Stephanie, any closing thoughts?
No, that's pretty much it. The only other link that's out there for you guys is a discussion thread in our forums. If you have more questions or want any more elaboration on anything you heard today, feel free to type those in the forum, and I'll make sure that Raja sees them and gets back to you. And yep, we'll announce the winner. There's 2 winners, so we'll announce them on Twitter. So stay tuned for that, and we'll also put them in the same discussion thread link that I put out there for you. You can check that as well. And with that, I'd love to thank Raja for his presentation today, and DJ for doing a great job moderating and staying on those questions, and thank all of you guys for attending, and hope to see you all at mycugc.org soon. And with that, I'll let you guys go. Thanks, Raja. Thanks, DJ.